future BCPS graduates. This is a video lesson for English 11 where we will explore how to analyze the interaction and development of multiple themes. This is lesson 2 found during the week of May 4th through 8th. Let's take a look at our objective for this lesson. After this lesson, you will be able to analyze the interaction and development of multiple themes in a short story in order to write a narrative. This objective has two distinct parts. The first is what you are learning. The second is how you'll demonstrate that learning. Let's take a closer look at the first part of this objective. As you are reading the story, you are going to be asked to analyze the interaction and development of multiple themes. In order to do this, you should ask yourself some questions as you read. First, what are the themes developed over the course of the text? On the theme tracker that you will use during the active reading portion of today's lesson, you'll be given a list of topics that you can choose from. Then you'll want to ask yourself, how does the development of one theme impact my understanding of the other? I will model this thinking using 2 of the 3 topics given to you on the theme tracker. Finally, you'll want to think about how do the narrative elements, such as plot, character, symbolism, and setting, help to develop one or both of the themes. It's important to note that these are not the only narrative elements, but simply a list that you can use to generate some initial ideas. Let's take a look at the second part of that objective. By the end of today's lesson, you will be asked to write a narrative. In order to do this, you're going to want to pay attention to the author's style, the way the author develops the character, and the themes that are developed throughout the story. The first learning task that you are asked to engage in is to think about it. This is a response to a quotation from the story. The quotation says, "She did not stop to ask if it were or were not a monstrous joy that held her. A clear and exalted perception enabled her to dismiss the suggestion as trivial." 2 things stand out to me when I read this quotation. The first is the term monstrous joy. When we think of joy, we think of it as a synonym for happiness. But that adjective monstrous makes me think that maybe the joy is in some way evil or not something that we would typically think of as bringing us happiness. The second part is the perception enabled her to dismiss the suggestion as trivial. So that makes me think that the way that the character sees the situation liberates her from how others might perceive her. So now that you've read that quotation, I want you to think about what question would you ask the main character and make a prediction. Why might the main character be experiencing a monstrous joy? The narrator is also implying that the main character is experiencing a happiness so intense that she doesn't care if it might seem monstrous. Have you ever felt happy and guilty about something at the same time? You're going to post your response in this discussion thread. It's important to note that you are not required to respond to others. This discussion response is a little more in depth than the ones that we've had in the past. So you're only responsible for posting your own response to this discussion question. Of course, you can always look at others' responses. So let's think about what it means to track multiple themes. During the previous lesson, you explored how central ideas in informational text can be stated explicitly and implicitly. They can either be directly found in the text or they can be implied, where the reader has to make an inference in order to connect the parts together. In literature, themes are often expressed implicitly, and they require us to interpret the author's development of all the narrative elements that are included. Before we go any further, go ahead and read the first 8 paragraphs of the story. Then you're going to examine the model on the next page. If you have control of the video, you can pause it now to read the first 8 paragraphs. If you do not have control over the video, you can simply jump to paragraphs 6 through 8 to follow along with the model. I'm going to reread paragraphs 6 through 8, and I'm going to think aloud the interaction and development of multiple themes that I notice in these paragraphs. I'm going to use my highlighter feature in order to track what stands out to me as important, or parts of the story that could be hinting at a possible theme. Paragraph 6 starts, "There were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west facing her window." I'm going to stop and highlight this. This is a description of the setting, and I think it could be important to the story. She sat with her head thrown back upon the cushion of the chair, quite motionless, except when a sob came up into her throat and shook her as a child who has cried itself to sleep continues to sob in its dreams. She was young, with a fair, calm face, whose lines bespoke repression and even a certain strength. I'm going to stop and underline that. The author is describing the character here, and we see two opposing parts, both repression and strength. But now there was a dull stare in her eyes, whose gaze was fixed away off yonder on one of those patches of blue sky. So this idea is being repeated. The character is looking at the blue sky now. That kind of signals to me that this might be important. It was not a glance of reflection, but rather indicated a suspension of intelligent thought. Now that I've finished reading this section, I'm going to go back to the parts that I highlighted and I'm going to try to think through them. So the first thing that I notice is that the patches of blue sky showing through the clouds makes me wonder about the time of year. And when I'm thinking about that, I have a prediction. I think this is the transition from winter to spring, where you have a cloudy gray sky. That makes me think of the winter time. And now that you have these patches of blue sky showing through, I think it might be transitioning from winter to spring. And from my other reading, I know that times of year can be symbolic. The winter typically represents death, and the spring typically represents new life. And so I think that might be an idea that's being developed here in this story. This is also kind of similar to the way that the main character's circumstances are changing now that her husband has died. So just as the world transitions from winter to spring, she is also in a time of transition from being a married woman to now being a widow. And so that might be important. And then finally, that last part, she was young with a fair, calm face whose lines bespoke repression. So to me, the lines on her face imply conflict that she's had in her past. And I also want to think about a question that I have. What caused her to feel repressed? I think it might be her relationship with her husband, but I'm not sure. I'm going to ask that question to guide me as I keep reading. Once I've thought through this section of the text, I'm going to go to my theme tracker. And so on my theme tracker, I know I have to document the page number, the quotation, the literary element, and then my interpretation or analysis. And so what I've done here is taken the evidence from my annotations and I have sorted them based on the literary element. So the first quotation is evidence of setting, and I've elaborated on my initial annotations. It's my interpretation that the author uses spring as the time of year to symbolize rebirth. Mrs. Mallard can see hope for her newfound independence as a widow, just as she can see the blue sky through the clouds. And then that second quotation is evidence of her character development. And to me, the description of the lines on Mrs. Mallard's face implies that she has experienced hardship in her marriage. However, the author also uses words like youth and strength to suggest to the reader that she will persevere through the loss of her husband and build a new life for herself. And so both of these themes, both her newfound independence and the oppressiveness of her marriage, interact with each other. We can't have one without the other. And so the author's use of these literary elements helps to convey this idea to me. Now you're going to try it. Finish reading the story and use the theme tracking sheet to record evidence of multiple topics in the short story. Then you're going to write a theme statement that expresses the author's message that incorporates both of the topics that you selected. So even though you are only writing one theme statement, that theme statement really needs to cover both of the topics that you track. In the Show What You Know portion, you are given a writing prompt. You're going to write a narrative paragraph. So this should be no longer than 5 to 8 sentences. And you're going to show Mrs. Mallard's thoughts and feelings upon seeing her husband enter the house. At the very end of the story, the author abruptly ends the story by telling us that her husband is alive. And then, of course, we see Mrs. Mallard dies of a heart attack. And so before that happens, we want to know what is it that Mrs. Mallard was thinking and feeling when she sees her husband enter the house. In your narrative, you want to incorporate at least 2 narrative elements: setting, character conflict, symbolism, internal dialogue, etc. And you want to make sure that you're also conveying 2 of the themes that you explored. So here are some brainstorming ideas of what you might want to keep in mind as you're writing your paragraph. You want to maintain the stylistic elements that the author has incorporated. So third-person limited narration, using settings symbolically and maintaining that objective, emotionless tone, since the narrator is simply commenting on what's happening. You want to express the motivations, feelings, and beliefs of the character. So we know that Mrs. Mallard is motivated by the feeling of freedom, and she's dreaded these long years with her husband. So what must she be thinking or feeling now that she knows that he's alive? And then finally, you want to incorporate narrative elements that demonstrate both the themes of the joy of independence and the oppressiveness of marriage. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.
Hello, and welcome to ELA Grade 12 for the week of May 4th, Lesson 1. Today, you will draw inferences and conclusions from a scientific article in order to analyze claims and counterclaims fairly and thoroughly. Think back to our lesson from last week on the genetic modification of the malaria-carrying mosquitoes. In the same way that the scientists can modify the genes of mosquitoes, they can also modify the genes of the food that is grown and sold for our consumption. So now consider the following questions. What do you know about genetically modified organisms in our food supply? And what are your opinions about whether food should be genetically modified? I'll give you a little bit of time to think those through. Now let's examine these images. They are in your print packet, but they may be easier to see here on the screen in color. Let's think about what each image conveys as we go through them. So if we start from the left, we have the infographic on methods of plant breeding. You'll see that this demonstrates the traditional way that plants are bred, which includes both desirable and undesirable genes. It also shows the way that plants are bred through genetic engineering. This allows scientists to manipulate the genes that are introduced to the plants being bred. This is similar to how scientists were able to manipulate the genes of the malaria-carrying mosquitoes to engineer a mosquito which did not carry that disease. Moving over to the image of the ear of corn being injected with a syringe. Does this image seem natural to you? Is it a comforting sight to see your food being injected with a syringe? Below the corn image, you see a strawberry, but the middle of it looks more like a kiwi. What might this suggest about genetic modification of food? How would you feel about eating a fruit that's a cross between a strawberry and a kiwi? And the fourth image on the top right is a logo that you may have seen on certain foods that would allow consumers to know that what they're buying does not contain any genetically modified organisms. Why might this be important? Why is it important that consumers know this, and what does that suggest about genetic modification of food? Now let's take a look at this infographic. As you review the information on the infographic, what pros or cons of genetic engineering can you find? I'll give you some time to take a look at the information. You may have noticed the two pieces of highlighted information as you were reviewing the infographic. These are both cons of using GMOs. The one on the left side says that mice fed GM pesticide-producing corn over 4 generations showed abnormal structural and chemical changes to various organs and significantly reduced fertility. And the one on the right side says that in 30 other countries, there are bans or restrictions on the production of GMOs because they are not considered safe. So that piece of information that GMOs are not considered safe is a con. Additionally, the information to the left of that, inside of the US graphic, states that in the US, it is not mandated that labels are on foods that contain GMOs. So what this means is that we as consumers are exposed to food that have GMOs in them that could be harmful to our health, but it's without our knowledge. So let's create a pro-con chart so that you can track the pros and cons of GMO foods throughout this lesson. So at this point, your pro-con chart is going to look something like this. We have yet to identify pros, but we've identified 3 cons from the infographic that we just looked at. So I'll give you just a little bit of time to get your chart set up and get those cons written down. Now you will examine the genetically modified foods timeline in your packet. You will look for pros and cons to using GMOs in foods, just like we did when we examined the infographic. So as you are reviewing the information in the timeline, you will annotate by placing a plus sign next to any information that shows positive effects of using genetically modified foods, and you'll place the negative sign next to any information that shows negative effects of using genetically modified foods. You will then add the positive effects to the pro side of your chart and the negative effects to the con side of your pro-con chart. So I will give you about a minute or two to get that done, and then we'll talk about what's in your chart. So taking a look at our pro-con chart, one pro that you may have listed from the timeline is that the use of GMOs can help create a larger food supply. Or you may have listed that several reputable organizations have stated that foods with GMOs are safe for humans to eat. On our con side, we had 3 already listed. You might have added to that the use of GMOs can possibly spread allergens in foods. And you may, of course, have additional or alternative information on your own chart. So as we draw some conclusions here, consider the following 2 questions. What does the information from the timeline suggest about the opinions surrounding the use of GMOs in our food supply? Why would some people feel strongly that food should be labeled as genetically modified and others want to prevent that from happening? Next, you will read, "Are genetically modified foods scary?" As you read, you'll identify advantages and disadvantages to using genetically modified foods and add them to your pro-con chart. Let's take a look at the first few paragraphs of the text together. So as I read these paragraphs aloud, you'll read along on your own text and annotate. Ever since the first farmers began to plant and harvest grains more than 10,000 years ago, humans have been looking for ways to increase agricultural production. Over the centuries and across the globe, farmers have developed tools and techniques to boost yields, such as irrigation, crop rotation, fertilizers, and pesticides. Today's agricultural innovations are more effective than ever, but also more controversial. Ireland, between the years 1845 and 1852, experienced a 7-year siege of mass starvation, disease, and emigration, known today as the Great Hunger. During this time, approximately 1 million people starved to death, and another 2 million fled for their lives, emigrating to England, America, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and other countries. The immediate cause of the famine was a potato blight, a disease that ravaged potato crops throughout Europe. The impact was most severe in Ireland because 1/3 of the population was dependent on the potato crop for survival. Political, social, and economic factors only exacerbated the horrendous results of the potato blight in Ireland. Recent advances in the field of genetically modified food could have prevented the Great Hunger by introducing potatoes resistant to the disease that destroyed Ireland's potato crop. In the 1990s, Hawaii's papaya industry was facing disaster because of the virulent papaya ring spot virus. In this case, a genetically modified papaya did save the day. Developed and used since 1999, this genetically modified papaya, which resists the virus, has saved Hawaii's papaya industry. So one advantage of GMOs that I noticed while I was reading was that a GMO could have prevented something like the disease that destroyed Ireland's potato crop, and that would have saved a lot of people from starvation. You may have also identified an advantage when it came to Hawaii's papaya industry. GMOs saved the papaya industry from the spot ring virus. So let's go ahead and add those two advantages of the use of using GMOs to the pro side of your pro-con chart. Next, you will finish reading the text, "Are genetically modified foods scary?" You'll take note of the claims made that support the use of GMOs and the counterclaims that point out the harmful effects of GMO use in our food supply, and you'll add the pros and cons that you identify to your pro-con chart. When you've finished reading, you'll review your chart and the pros and cons that are listed. As you consider and analyze these points, you'll formulate your own position on the use of GMOs in our food supply. I'll give you a few minutes to do that now. All right, so we have come to the final portion of our lesson for today, and we are faced with the question, to use or not to use GMOs. So, using what you know about genetically modified foods, you will now compose a script for a mini TED Talk that asserts and defends your position on the consumption of genetically modified foods. So think about the following scenario. Your family member or friend is going to the grocery store to stock up on food. They ask you whether they should buy foods that are specifically labeled as non-genetically modified, or if they should not really worry too much about it. Your family member or friend has heard something about GMOs, but just doesn't really know if they're an important consideration when choosing what foods to eat. So what would you tell this person? What reasons and evidence would you use to develop your position on the issue and convince them of it? What brief background information might this person need to know in order to fully understand what genetically modified foods are? Once you've finished creating your mini TED Talk, if you have the opportunity, share it with a family member or friend. See if they learn something from you. Or better yet, engage in a thoughtful debate about the use of GMOs in our food supply. So this concludes our lesson for the week of May 4th. Thank you for joining me today.